Welcome to Eggs and Issues, a monthly business forum presented by the Portland Community Chamber of Commerce, bringing timely economic discussion to the region for nearly 40 years. Thank you to our sponsors and partners. Presenting sponsors, Bank of America and Martins Point Healthcare. Cooperating sponsor, Harvard Pilgrim Healthcare. Reception sponsors, Clark Insurance, Key Bank, and Viral. Community Corner sponsor, Goral Palmer. Tomorrow's leaders and entrepreneur sponsors, AAA Northern New England and ProSearch. Coffee sponsor, Skowhegan Savings. Parking sponsor, Vitalius Real Estate Group. Media partners, radio sponsor, WGAN. Print sponsor, The Forecaster. TV sponsor, WMTW Maine CW. Business news sponsor, Maine Biz, with production support provided by Headlight. And thank you to our special community partners, Anthem Blue Cross Blue Shield, MEMIC, Spectrum Healthcare Partners, Southern Maine Community College, and the University of Southern Maine. And now, please welcome Portland Community Chamber President, Britt Vitalius.
Good morning and welcome to our October Eggs and Issues program, the monthly business breakfast event series of the Portland Community Chamber of Commerce. As we continue the 2021-22 Eggs and Issues season, I would like to welcome all of you here in person, which is great. It's so nice to see you, and virtually who are watching from your home or office. Okay, second one in person. So far, so good. Maybe we're starting to return to normal-ish a little bit. It's kind of nice to be back. My name is Britt Vitalius. I'm the president of Vitalius Real Estate Group, and I'm really happy to be here, and I'm honored to serve as the volunteer president of the Portland Community Chamber of Commerce Board of Directors. Today's presentation is another timely one. We'll be discussing Maine's housing shortage. This is a topic I've been personally involved with, and I'm really excited for the conversation because we have what may be the perfect panel of experts, each functioning at the highest level in their particular sector and the highest level of respect for the work they do in the community. But before we get into today's presentation, I want to take a moment to thank all of our Eggs and Issue sponsors who make this event possible, whether virtual or in person. This is important stuff. You should know that ticket sales do not cover this event, and the sponsors are really key to the chamber, key to the fact that events like this can happen, bring us together to serve our community and the business community. So we really want to give these folks a great thanks. First and foremost, our presenting sponsors, Bank of America and Martins Point Healthcare. I also want to thank our other generous sponsors, our cooperating sponsor, Harvard Pilgrim Healthcare, reception sponsor, Clark Insurance, Key Bank, and Viral. Our community corner sponsor, Goral Palmer. Today's community corner featured member is HopeAx. Founded in 2012 by the Hope Gateway Faith Community, HopeAx has a deep commitment to supporting the hundreds of new asylum seekers to our country, both Hope House residents as well as asylum seekers and families who live in parts of our community. So these new Mainers have the opportunity to thrive in our community. We are fortunate to be joined by members of HopeAx staff and board of directors. If you're with us today, please stand and be recognized. This really is an incredible organization. I've worked with them personally. They're just outstanding. The Chamber is fortunate to have a strong relationship with HopeAx, and we are thankful for all that you do to help educate, workforce train, and house these valuable Mainers. An example of many of the solutions that will be part of today's conversation. And in appreciation of your work, the Portland Community Chamber of Commerce will be making a $100 donation to your organization. I also want to mention, related to HopeAx, that on November 10th at 5 p.m., HopeAx and Propel are doing a joint event called The Journey to a Multicultural Workplace, a conversation with new Mainers and HopeAx. So put that on your calendar. You'll see more from the Chamber and from HopeAx, but another great event coming up. Tomorrow's leaders and entrepreneur sponsors, AAA Northern New England, and the new 2021-22 sponsor ProSearch. Through our Tomorrow's Leaders program, the Chamber is able to invite students in the region, high school and college, to attend Exit Issues at no cost. With us today are students from Falmouth High School, Gorham High School, and USM. A few of these students today are joining us remotely, but if you're here in person, please stand and be recognized. All right. This is great. Thank you for coming. Thank you for being here. Our coffee sponsor, Skowhegan Savings, and our parking sponsor, Vitalis Real Estate Group. And a special thank you to our media partners, The Forecaster, WGAN, WTMW, Maine CW, and Maine Biz. Our FMI, that's for more information sponsor, is the Portland Public Library, with production support both on-site and with a virtual broadcast is provided by Headlight Audio Visual. And thank you to the Holiday Inn by the Bay. We are so happy to be back here in person, safely once again. And finally, a very special thank you to our special community partners, all who support the Chamber and all our initiatives. Anthem, Spectrum Healthcare Partners, University of Southern Maine Community College, and MEMIC. Let's have a round of applause for all of our generous sponsors. Before we start the program, I want to make a couple special notes about several items that are related to the work we're doing at the Portland Community Chamber. In November, Portland will have their annual municipal elections, including 3 open city council seats and 3 school board seats. I cannot stress enough the importance of getting involved in these municipal elections that will drive policy in Portland for years to come. If you want to learn more about the candidates and the issues, please reach out to the advocacy staff at the Chamber who can talk to you about ways to be involved through donations, volunteering, and voting. It is rare to have a time in which 3 city council seats are open, so we must work hard to ensure candidates are elected that share the Chamber's commitment to affordable housing, public transportation, and workforce development. Additionally, I will remind you that the Portland's ongoing Charter Commission process is underway. The outcomes from the commission will determine Portland's form of municipal government for decades to come, so we call on all our members to be engaged with this process, understand the issues before the commission, and make your voices heard as the commission studies what Portland's leadership should look like. Now, before we get to today's presentation, I want to preface with just another quick reminder that like all Eggs and Issues programs, we'll be recording the event today, which will be available on the Chamber's YouTube site for viewing after. We also are streaming the program live for those joining us remotely. Welcome. And if you have additional questions following today's program, you're welcome to send them to the Chamber at chamber@portlandregion.com. Okay, on to today's topic. Housing in Maine. This is a big one, and I'm reminded before we get into this that this is going to be part of a series. We're going to do at least one more of these because housing is just such a driving issue, and this is a great forum to have this conversation, and today is the first one. So in today's presentation, you're going to hear about important topics ranging from increasing our overall housing inventory, addressing homelessness, and furthering economic growth through zoning and land use reforms that encourage development that is close to public transit, jobs, and schools. So this time, I'd like to introduce our panelists and moderator for today's program. Joining me on stage now are our moderator, Kristina Egan, the Executive Director of the Greater Portland Council of Governments, GPCOG, as well as panelist Kevin Bunker, who's the founding principal of the Developers Collaborative, Jeff Levine, owner and principal of Levine Planning Strategies and faculty lecturer at MIT, and Cullen Ryan, the Executive Director at Community Housing of Maine. Welcome to our guests, and I'm going to hand it over to Kristina.
Good morning. Thank you so much, Britt and Quincy and the entire Chamber team for giving the 4 of us an opportunity today to talk about the housing issues in Maine. I'm going to first paint a brief picture of the problem. We're not going to spend a lot of time on this because I know that all of us are feeling the housing issue in our daily lives, if not for ourselves, then for our families, our friends, or in our communities. And then I'm going to share some goals that we think we should be aiming for and how you can help with them. Then we're going to take a deeper dive into the issues, and with 3 very effective practitioners. We have Jeff, who has been working for years to set the table for fair and good development. We have Cullen, who's been helping people for decades escape homelessness. And we have Kevin, who's been building affordable housing throughout Maine. So let's first go to a couple data points. We'll go to the next slide. What you see here is a map that shows places in red where homes are not affordable to the average resident in Cumberland County. Now I'm going to show you what it looks like today. So this is 2000, this is 2020. And you can see that the workforce is needing to move further away from jobs. We call this driving until you qualify. The second data point relates to renting. And we'll go to the next one. So if you are an average income person in Cumberland County seeking to rent a 2-bedroom apartment, you are going to be expected to pay about 44% of your income toward rent. That doesn't allow for anything else. So we'll go to the next slide. I'm going to show you a selection of a few different headlines. As employers, you know how housing prices have impacted your workforce. You may have had an experience like mine where I've tried to offer a job to somebody out of state, and they call back and they say, hey, I just checked out your housing market. It's a lot more expensive than I thought, and I'm sorry, I can't come, right? How many of you have had an experience like that? Anybody? Yeah. So that's an issue on your workforce. But as human beings that have hearts, we also are seeing the suffering on our streets of people who are experiencing homelessness. These 2 issues of lack of affordable housing and homelessness have only gotten worse during the pandemic. And that's because Maine has been relatively safe during the pandemic, so more people have come here. And I think that this trend will likely continue because when you look at the climate change data, Maine is also going to be one of the most climate safe places in the future. So when there's so little housing on the market, even a modest number of people who come here can tip us towards crisis. Next, please. This is a picture from 2019 when about 400 asylum seekers came to the Portland area, and it was over a very short period of time. And you may have read in the papers in the last week, we have another 300 asylum seekers from Africa and also from Haiti who are coming, and we have another 100 or so Afghan refugees. Next slide, please. So Portland and the 6 surrounding communities that I work with, the cities and towns, we have recognized the need for municipalities to play a leadership role in expanding housing and addressing homelessness. And we've set 2 goals. The first one you see here on the screen. We have about 65,000 housing units in 7 communities. So we want to expand that by about 6,500 units. And you can see in the graph, next, that that's about 1,300 a year. If you could go to the next graphic. Thank you. You can see 1,300 in the blue targets at the top. We published our first housing progress report in 2020, and you can see what we did. We had about 68 affordable units and about 600 or so that were market rate. So we weren't meeting the target of 1,300, and we really weren't meeting the target of making the housing affordable to low and middle income people. Our second goal, and we'll go to the next one, to click twice, is regarding homelessness. And the people that are experiencing homeless in Portland, they come from Portland, they come from outside of Portland, and they even come from outside of the state. So what this means is that Portland bears the burden of people from all over the place, and particularly Portland taxpayers. So our goal as municipalities is to reduce the number of people that are experiencing homelessness, but also more equitably spread the burden of those costs across all of the communities. We'll go to the next. So we know that we were making some incremental progress, but why weren't we making a lot of progress? The housing market is super hot. We know that developers want to build housing. So we asked Jeff Levine to work with our talented group of planners and data specialists at GPCOG to find out why. And what he did is he produced this map that basically shows the places where multifamily housing is buildable. And that's the blue places. You can see this is downtown Westbrook, Mayor Foley, thank you. And it's the Peninsula, and it's Scarborough Downs. These are all great places to build housing, but it's only about 5% of the land in these 7 communities. So what's happening in the red and the orange areas? What kind of development is happening there? Next slide. It's predominantly large homes on large lots that few people can afford. And this is what our zoning laws are set up to encourage. And they discourage the kind of development that we've had as traditional New England villages and downtowns. It is very difficult to build the things that we love. So we'll go to the next slide. At the Greater Portland Council of Governments, we've worked with planners, municipalities, transit agencies, and residents to identify about 24 places where we think it makes sense to add more housing. These are places where people are already living, working, playing, shopping. They are also places that have probably enough infrastructure to add more housing. Now, when you think about adding housing, it can feel a little scary, but we're not talking about Tokyo. We're not talking about Boston. What we're really talking about is housing that can be well designed and can be inserted into a place and reinforce the neighborhood feeling. We'll go to the next slide. I'm going to show you 2 examples of this. This is a 6-unit apartment building. This can fit into a lot of the downtown areas, crossroads, villages. But if you wanted to just have 5 units, you can make something look like a farmhouse. And I'm going to show you the next one here. This is a 5-unit. It fits in just about any kind of village that we have in the Greater Portland area. So this brings me to my last slide, which is 2 asks for you. The first is for you to stand up for good housing in your community. And when affordable housing is proposed, or housing is proposed in places that make sense, where people already live, where there's infrastructure, say that you want it. I'm a former town councilor, and I hear a lot about what people don't want. What we don't hear is what people want. And if we want to solve the workforce problem and we want to take care of our neighbors, we need to welcome the housing. The second ask is for you to make your voices heard in Augusta. And the Chamber does an awesome job of this. In fact, Egan drafted some incredible testimony that was submitted yesterday. But for you all to let your legislators know that we need changes at the state level that can encourage more housing. We need resources, but we also need good policy. So now we're going to turn to our panelists. They're going to spend some more time talking to you about what the problem is and the solution. And I'm really excited. As I said before, these are 3 extraordinary practitioners that we get to hear from this morning. The first is Jeff Levine, and he has a consulting firm, Levine Planning Strategies, and he used to be the planning director for the city of Portland. He and I worked together then, and now we have the pleasure of working together on lots of projects now that he's a consultant. He's also shaping the next generation of planners as a faculty lecturer at MIT. And if that's not enough, he was just named the interim director of the Maine Affordable Housing Coalition. He is joined by Cullen Ryan. He's the executive director of the Community Housing of Maine, called CHOM. I was told, like mom. CHOM like mom. So and CHOM is a housing provider for people with special needs and people experiencing homelessness. He's been a licensed clinician, so he's worked on the front lines, delivering direct services for many years. And then he is joined by Kevin Bunker. And Kevin is the founding principal of Developers Collaborative. And that firm develops and manages real estate. And they do it with a purpose. They're guided by smart growth principles, sustainability, affordability, and great design. And you may not know it, but you've seen his work here in Portland. He is also the developer of the new shelter, which is actually a new homeless service center, not just a shelter. So you've got the great opportunity to hear from these people. And we are going to start with Jeff.
Do I go up?
Nope, just right there.
Great, thanks so much. If we could just move on to the next slide. Thanks for having me. One of the things I wanted to mention is, it's funny when you're going down to Boston occasionally, I always feel like they're a little bit ahead of the terminology here, and apparently the term YIMBY is transitioning into this idea of abundant housing. So if you really want to be cutting edge in Portland, talk about abundant housing. Because everything seems to be it's always sort of where the ball's going. Next slide, please. Thanks for having me. I wanted to just highlight quickly 2 of the reasons why we all should care about this, and I think it was framed nicely in Kristina's presentation in terms of the 2 ways you could be active. This is sort of on the personal level, the idea that housing is really one of the base things that people need. And as an academic now, I try to use charts that cite people. So Maslow's hierarchy of needs is sort of the level of how you can get to personal fulfillment. And at the top, you imagine the person sitting cross-legged, meditating. But at the bottom, you have these basic physiological needs. And these are more important than things like self-esteem or safety. These are just things you need. These are very basic. Health, food, water, and shelter is one of those things. If you can't get shelter, you're never going to be meditating on that hill, reading self-actualization, let alone raising a family, supporting a family, contributing to the economy. Next slide. But I think just as importantly, housing is really an economic issue. When I came to start teaching at MIT, one of the things that I was told to teach was economic development. And I said, you can't teach that without teaching about housing development. And they said, that's great. So I've taken all these courses that were about economic development and said, this is about housing and economic development. And the reason is, look at these charts. These are from the Living Wage Calculator, which is a great website that a colleague of mine puts together. And it calculates how much you need to earn in various parts of the country to basically support yourself. And so I pulled 3 different communities. It's a little hard to read, but for one adult in Portland, the housing cost is estimated at about $10,900. And without anything to compare that to, it's hard to say. But then you look at a place like Lynchburg, Virginia, a perfectly nice place to live, and it's $7,500. And then even in Portland, even in Maine, you look at Lewiston, and it's $7,300. So that may not seem like a big difference, but for someone making close to a minimum wage, that's actually a huge difference. And this is going to hurt Portland's economic competitiveness. Now, when you look at places like Austin, of course, they're at the same number as Portland, but they're not higher. That's what surprised me. They're at $10,000, $11,000. There are very few places that are higher than Portland in the entire country. Next slide. So just briefly, what is affordable housing? This is a term that gets thrown out a lot. And you mentioned that I think that renters spend 42% of their income on housing. Really, the rule of thumb is that you're not supposed to spend more than 30% of your income in housing. And when you hear affordable housing, I often sort of in the nitpicker and correct people. Affordable can mean affordable for someone who's making $1 million a year or nothing. It really generally means affordable for lower income households. And so I often will use the term below market affordable housing. And this is often tied to area median income, which is a measure that the federal government uses. And just pulling some numbers for the Portland region, this gives you a sense of what that area median income is. That's the median income for households in the region. So for a household of 4, it's $78,500. And that goes up or down every year. But the question is, what percentage of that do you really try to target? And that's where you can start playing with the levers. Some programs target lower numbers, some target higher numbers. But this is a common baseline you'll see. So now you know what AMI is. That's what people will use that acronym are referring to. Next slide. Finally, I just wanted to show a chart when you do an analysis, and this happens to be in Bath, Maine, but this is true almost anywhere in Maine where you do this sort of calculation. You don't need to focus on everything on this chart, but simply look from left to right, and it goes from lower income to higher income households. And you'll see which ones are housing burdened, are spending more than 30% of their income on housing, and that's the red bars. And it's always at those lower income levels, which really isn't surprising. But the rate is really stark, and it shows how few housing options people have at those income levels that they end up spending more than 30% of their income on housing. When you get up to the higher incomes, obviously, it gets lower. But again, you still have people who are paying for too much house. That's not really a big problem for us because they can just size down, but the lower income households can't. I think there might be one more slide. Nope, that's it. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Jeff. All right, well, next go to Cullen.
Good morning. First of all, thank you for hosting us today and for being here, because this is a really important and vital conversation. I work with community housing in Maine. We're a small nonprofit, but we focus on creating really nice housing and then welcoming in homeless and special needs populations in. And what we find is that when you create nice housing that communicates dignity and respect, anyone who moves in does well. And just as some folks that we house here, we're the largest housing provider for homeless populations in the state. We don't want to be, but we're just modeling it and showing that it can be done really well. Next slide, please. Homelessness can be ended. That's the good news. We invented it by cutting out housing. We've promulgated it by not allowing people to access services and making it really difficult and challenging. We can end it by actually housing people and making sure that they have the support they need for success. We know how to do it. We're just waiting for the resources. Next slide, please. I work with a group of 16 organizations that meet on a weekly basis and go through the list of the longest stayers in homelessness. And we've been housing people who are homeless up to 32 and 33 years before moving in. I can tell you it's transformative when somebody moves into housing. I once worked with somebody in 1997 who moved in 2013. He'd been homeless for decades. He looked younger a couple weeks after he moved in than he did in 1997. People die in their 50s at my age. when they experience long-term homelessness. We don't need to have that happen. It's incredibly expensive. This population ricochets through our most expensive emergency systems, and this chart shows, this is just last month's data, just a hair over last month's, but the same population, housed and unhoused. We've housed 350 long-term stayers in this committee. Same group, 30 people who were unhoused were 39 times more likely to be in jail in August of this year than the people who were housed. And they were over 8 times more likely to be in the hospital when unhoused than housed. That's dramatic. It's really expensive to have people cycling in and out of jail, and they're there because they don't have a place to use the bathroom, because they are out in public and people don't want them there. When people are housed, people do much better. Next slide, please. This is the cost of having somebody in jail, $47,000 a year. It's $160,000 to have somebody in the hospital. We're doing that instead of having people in housing. We know that shelter alone is $14,000 a year. Next slide, please. But housing somebody with support services, our most expensive intervention in Portland, is $15,600. And instead, we're spending $1,000 a day to have them in the hospital, many hundreds of dollars to see somebody cycle in and out of jail. We can stop this. It doesn't need to happen. And it's through housing that we're going to do that. It's a paradigm shift. Next slide. Nope, that's it. Thank you.
Colin, that was great, and really reinforcing that you can take care of the human cost, but also it makes financial sense.
Yes.
Thank you. Kevin.
Hi, Kevin Bunker. I'm glad to be here this morning. My company is called Developers Collaborative. We develop all sorts of things based on smart growth, as Kristina said, but kind of got into development by accident and got into affordable housing by accident. But over the past decade and a half, we've built or designed about 1,000 units of affordable housing. So we've been doing that work for a long time, and it's a little frustrating because this panel is so good and the time is so short to do these deep dives into issues. But I am the developer of the new Homeless Services Center and got involved in that not because it's an economic issue really, but Jeff's Maslow pyramid was interesting because I am on that self-actualization part and I get to work on what I believe in at this point, and that's something that I do believe in. And just the fact that there's a humanitarian crisis going on in Portland and we have a chance to end it and we have a chance to do something. And my fear is that the political will took a long time to build to get to this point, and that if we don't take action now, it might be a long time before, if ever, before that political will builds again. And we thought we could lend ourselves to it and try to get it over the hump and get folks housed. So we've designed a 209-bed shelter with wraparound services. I'm not a homelessness expert. I know a lot about it. I'm not an expert like Colin, but I have experts on my team, and we're listening to folks who are unhoused now and really designing something that we think will be a huge benefit. We have medical services on site. We have all sorts of counseling services on site, so folks don't have to run all around the peninsula to get services. It's all right there. And we're trying to get that over the hump and get it built this year, get started this year. In terms of affordable housing, which I was asked to be the affordable housing guy, you know, it's a complex problem, but Jeff's graph was really the best way to look at it because rising house prices are not always a bad thing economically. A lot of economists will tell you high house prices are good because they create the wealth effect and they incite people to spend money, and it's kind of good for the economy. If you walk around and poll someone on the street who owns a single-family house and ask them if they would like their house value to be $300,000 lower, they will say no. So it's a good thing at certain levels, and it's at worst not a problem at higher levels. But Jeff's graph shows that those lower-income folks have nowhere to go, and there's not, for all the affordable housing headlines you read about and units that get built, that really is just a drop in the bucket in terms of what needed. After World War II, our demographic income period chart kind of looked like this. There are about as many people there are much fewer high-income people, and lower-income people were not as numerous, and the middle-income people was sort of a regular-looking pyramid. Now it's hollowed out, and we have a few really, really wealthy people at the top and a whole lot of people at the bottom, and nowhere near enough housing to build for them. So we can't solve all these housing problems. It's inappropriate that we should try to put severely limited resources to help middle and higher income households because there's just not the level of need that's there. And there are federal currents and trends that we can't control. In an inflationary environment that we're in today with super low interest rates, all the money is flying into assets. And you know, when I build market rate things too, and we can charge, if we build a condominium and our builder charges us $20,000 more, we can raise the price $20,000 and the buyer pays it and it's not an issue. But for folks that don't have that option and who are not getting higher incomes and who do not have stocks, bonds, portfolios, ownership of things, and their incomes aren't going up, they get worse and worse and worse off after time. And that's kind of something that's endemic in our society that we should be looking at. So really, I think that when we look at policy responses and zoning responses, any kind of intervention that we can do that we may talk about today, it should really be focused first on the folks at the lowest end of the income pyramid, and then as you gradually rise in income, we should spend less and less time dealing with it and more time letting the market do what it does.
Great, thank you so much, Kevin. So we've heard a little bit about why housing matters from all three of you, but I want to give you one more chance just to kind of bear down on why the folks in this room and who are watching today really should care about housing. And Colin, I might start with you. You talked a little bit about homelessness. Can you talk a little bit about housing in general?
Sure. I have worked with people experiencing homelessness for 34 years, and I just have to say that no one does well without housing. You take a person with any level of complexities and you leave them without a place to live, they're in crisis, and they don't look good, they don't fare well, they don't feel well, they don't access our systems, nothing goes well, and it's really expensive. Put that same person into housing, and we watch somebody get well, do well, be well, use the same systems that we use, primary care physicians instead of emergency rooms. They stop using emergency systems altogether. It's the right thing to do. It can't happen without housing. I've been a street outreach worker in cities. I have tried to engage people when they're outside or when they're homeless. People who are working with people outside right now have to spend their time trying to find them, locate them, try to establish trust and rapport with people. Very hard to do when people are isolative and distrustful and really disenfranchised altogether. They spend their time then talking about how that person can get through tonight. What do you need to get through tonight? It's really a waste of time. That same person who's really skilled, if you move that person into a housing, can talk about what they can do to be successful and to get back into employment and engagement in society. It's like having a four-wheel drive on a hill in the snow. You can suddenly start to get somewhere. Housing is the baseline that everybody needs, and unfortunately, we've left that out of our equation. We don't have an adequate supply, we're not welcoming people in, and we've left a whole lot of people out. And it's costing us in every single way.
Thanks, Colin. And Kevin and Jeff, do you want to add anything about the economic impact of expanding housing choices?
Well, yeah, back when I was in grad school learning from folks like Jeff, I remember a professor said to me, housing is the flywheel of the economy. And it's most folks' largest store of value that they have if they own a house. It's 13% of GDP in 2020, so it's a big sector. And then the idea that it's not just an economic issue, but it's a humanitarian issue. If you can build more housing and do good in both factors and not have a trade-off one against the other like you often would have, that's a double win, and it's it's a layup for public policy to work on housing because you can influence so many things, so many facets of folks' lives.
I like the sports analogy, just wedged right in there. Thank you. Jeff?
The only thing that I would add quickly is, you're all trying to attract talent to your organizations. And to me, Portland's like a nightclub that has a really high fee to get in. You have to have a certain amount of wealth to get into this market right now. There's lots of people moving to Portland, but they tend to be people who have families with money, or they have money of their own, or they had a house in the suburbs of Boston and they sold it for a ton of money. That's like a price to get in. And that limits your talent pool. You want to bring in some of those folks who aren't going to pay that cover charge to get to Portland. And right now, it's a pretty high cover charge.
Yeah, great, Jeff. And we're going to stay with you for a second because I want to explore a little bit some of the root causes of the housing shortage. And I wonder if you could explain a little bit about kind of the exclusionary zoning history that we're all sitting on top of and what's happening now that's really kind of depressing housing production, particularly a diverse housing stock.
Sure. I mean, it's really interesting to go through the history of zoning in general and a lot of the good reasons why it exists, and I believe it does serve a good purpose. But honestly, there's a lot of bad reasons why it exists too. A lot of the zoning in the early 20th century was explicitly race-based and said these are areas where whites can live, these are areas where people that aren't whites can live. That was thrown out by the Supreme Court, but a lot of communities backed into other ways of doing that. And one of the common ways is to basically stratify housing ostensibly by type, but really by price. And that's what happens when you have single-family zoning with large lots layered on top of extensive design review, on top of historic rules, on top of other requirements, to the point where the only people who are going to get into that club are the ones who have the assets to do that and who want that particular housing type. Now, one of the changes that's happened in the last 20 years is wealthy people have discovered downtown in a way they hadn't before. And that's sort of almost the opposite of what I think we really need, which is to allow people with a variety of incomes more choices than to live in the areas that don't have these 6 or 7 layers of requirements. And therefore, it's more possible to build housing less expensively and charge less for it. Again, a lot of the things that, shoreline zoning is really important. We were talking before about sewer. In order to get density, you're going to need water and sewer. Those are important public health, safety, and welfare reasons to regulate. But a lot of the stuff that's out there is really a proxy for separating by race, by class, and that's not okay. And it's not good for the economy either.
So, Jeff, you've spoken a little bit about how zoning has created this housing shortage. And Colin, I want to turn to you and just ask, is the lack of affordable housing actually a cause of homelessness?
It is. The last time that we had an adequate supply of affordable housing in the United States was in 1977. We stopped creating affordable housing at any sort of a rate at that point, and then in the early 1980s, we cut HUD's budget in half. And that produced homelessness that was visible. We watched people jump into homelessness in the 1980s that we've never seen before. So again, we invented it. We cut HUD's budget again in the early 2000s dramatically, and then we went through a budget hold period for 11 years that essentially we'd be lucky to get HUD's budget back to what it was in 2009. Think about how expensive housing was in 2009 compared to today. Everything has changed and we've not kept up. So we've boxed out our antidote to this by not creating housing as a country. And we now need to reinvest and actually invigorate this whole part. And we need to start thinking of housing as infrastructure. It is. Without it, we don't have the ability to do all the things that everybody has been saying here today. And we lack it.
And Kevin, I want to offer you the opportunity to weigh in on what some of the reasons are that we have insufficient housing and maybe even insufficient diversity of housing choices.
Yeah, I think that the diversity is an important point because the housing shortage, I think, is an oversimplification of what we really have going on. There was a study that MIT did for the Maine Affordable Housing Coalition back a few years back, and what they really were able to highlight really well is that we have a housing mismatch. They looked at it by region and they talked about the types of housing that we need in a region and the types of housing that we have. And for example, in Greater Portland, there was a lack of stock for new entrants and a lack of affordable housing. Shouldn't be a surprise to anyone, but the challenges in rural Maine, for example, are very different. We have a lot of folks who may not have a mortgage, who may be house rich, cash poor, and are spending way too much on taxes and heat, and they would like to have a smaller unit that isn't available. So the idea that we have a housing shortage, I think to me sometimes implies that we have tens of thousands of people lining up to wait to get into a house that doesn't exist or who are standing at the border wanting to move in. That absolutely is a problem. But we have housing units, they're just the wrong kind and they're in the wrong place. So that MIT study for me really helped me think a lot more about housing interventions and what types of housing we should build where, not just more, all kinds all the time, because it's not really the right metric to look at.
And where we build it really matters also.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So let's not get too depressed and move towards some solutions. And I'm going to start with you, Jeff. At a very high level, what do you think are some of the most promising approaches to addressing these problems?
Well, I think we need to start realizing how integral housing is to the economy, and part of that is for communities to embrace the idea that this is part of what makes them great places. I think New England communities have forgotten about the traditional village, where there was a variety of people living in a variety of housing types. You know, communities will often fight housing, saying it's bad for our community character. And I try to flip that paradigm on its head and say, actually, this is the community character you're striving for. This is what New England towns were before zoning, before the big single-family home and the 3 automobiles and the SUV. Don't you want that? Isn't that a part of what you want to create? And it's a little bit of a, it's not just playing with words, it really does matter. And it reminds people of what's really important, I think. So trying to create the idea that a variety of housing is important for community character is much better than saying, well, forget about community character, we just need the housing. Because that's just a losing fight. That's just going to put people on one side or the other of the debate. And the other piece of that I would always add is people talk about sort of the burden of affordable housing. Affordable housing is an asset. It is not a burden. People say, well, why is it our fair share? Why do we have to bear our fair share? As if it's something that's bad for their community. These things, the type of projects, the types of developments these guys are building are good for the community. And I think we need to embrace that, and we need to use the right terminology to inspire people that this is a goal to aspire to, not just something to suffer through.
Well, and we also know that for cities and towns, many of them with unaffordable housing, they can't house their firefighters, their teachers, and if you're a parent and you want your kid to come back and live in their hometown, they can't afford it. So being able to provide that actually does build the community character and keeps the community fabric in place. And Kevin, I'm going to invite you to kind of weigh in on what you see as a really promising solution, and then Cullen, I'm going to talk to you specifically about homelessness. But Kevin, why don't you go first about where should we be approaching this issue?
I think the zoning conversation that's happening now at the regional and state level is huge. That just to be able to talk openly about zoning being an issue at a Chamber of Commerce event is amazing. You know, that wasn't when I started getting into planning 20 years ago, that was a radical idea. Now it's sort of accepted and you see heads nodding and people kind of get it. So we've come a long way. We're still going to run up against that same thing that the early Grow Smart work and Governor King came up against, which is regional solutions and local control. You know, that whole idea that towns are autonomous, but solutions need to be regional. That's why, you know, every town has a fire truck that doesn't need one. Every town wants someone else to do the affordable housing. You know, I had a early mentor, Richard Berman, who used to say that he had a conversation with a town councilor, who I won't name the town to embarrass anybody from the town, but it was a wealthy town. And he said, "Don't you believe in affordable housing?" And he said, "Yeah, I believe in affordable housing in Wyndham." And those,
so it wasn't from Wyndham.
The counselor wasn't from Wyndham. The counselor was from one of those other towns. But anyway, it was very telling, and that attitude has to change. But in terms of solutions, I think, again, some promising things to do would be to look at the limited resources we have, targeting them toward folks under 60% of median income. But then at 60% of median income, what a lot of people don't follow is that that's when the subsidies end, the federal subsidies basically end. And then there's this gap before anybody can really afford a decent home up to about 100% of median. And so somebody at 61% of area median income is in a really rough place because there's no help for them. And we can't build them a housing unit that's any good for anywhere near what they can afford. So there's not a lot of public subsidy and public help going into those folks at 60, 70, 80% of median income. And I think we need a little bit more of that.
And Kevin, you mentioned that there's some really interesting things happening at the state level, and we are going to come back to that. Put them in the bike rack for the moment, but we're going to come back to that with Jeff in a little bit. I want to turn to homelessness again. And Cullen, you've been working in the field of homelessness for 34 years, and you used to run the Oxford Street Shelter here in Portland. I want you to touch a little bit on the proposed homeless service center. Can you tell us a little bit about what's planned and why you think it might be a good thing?
Sure. Well, first of all, Kevin has designed a fantastic shelter, and I've seen a lot of shelters across the country, and this is a wonderful design. Second of all, this is really a political situation here. Folks are essentially weaponizing homelessness and using it as a tool to sort of create a platform issue. I walked by one of the signs today on my way here, and you know, you've got a small building with a heart on it, and it looks great. And apparently we love to have people in a duplex that was the wrong size in 1980 when it was created. And we love the idea of having people go on a wild goose chase searching for the resources they need to end homelessness. Throughout homelessness, we also love having people on full display in front of us when they're at their darkest times. I don't know if any of you have been in the hospital for surgery or had to spend a day or two there, but my guess is that you would have preferred to have a closed curtain or some privacy, and we don't do that with people who are faring through their worst, most challenging, most difficult times. Instead, we have them wander around through our cities. That's terrible. Nobody thinks that what's going on right now is right. There is no plan for smaller shelters. There's no menu that's going to have us, should we have 5 or should we have 1? We have actually a plan that's been in place for 5 years to create 1. If you were homeless, you would want to have one place that you could go to very quickly get all of your needs met. Like if you had surgery, you would want to go to a hospital and solve that, not go wander around for, they're gonna cut you open over here and then you walk 4 blocks over here and they'll start going inside to find the thing. It doesn't make sense. I think that if you can create efficiencies and have everything in one place that everybody needs, that makes the most sense. That's exactly what's planned for the city. That should go through. I hope that folks won't be confused or misled by this idea of smaller shelters that are not going to exist. There's not going to be 5 communities that welcome in homeless shelters. There's not going to be an ability to pay for 5 resource centers. They won't exist. Nonprofits that provide services are not going to be able to travel around through the city and deliver services and help people in different locations. But they can do one. They can go to one place. We can surround people with what they need. We can most efficiently get them into housing. And that's what they want. That's what we want. And we're actually on track to do that right now. The question is, are we going to throw that away and leave the status quo? Or are we actually going to move towards something that will end homelessness? I hope we move towards something that will end homelessness. That's why I'm against the smaller shelters initiative. I'm actually going to vote for neither.
Thanks, Colin. And Kevin, as the developer of the Homeless Service Center, is there anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, for me, it's a question of timing. A big question is about the timing. I've been watching the issue from the sidelines and reading the paper and involved in Portland politics and development, and there was this debate over whether it was better to provide the resources in one place, in one site, or multiple sites. That debate was had, a lot of work, a lot of study, a lot of reporting, and finally a consensus of sorts was reached to go with one solution. Then it was, okay, where is it going to be? There were a lot of sites proposed. This is maybe the 3rd or 4th one that wasn't rejected. So finally we have a site. All this work takes years. It takes seconds to describe it. It takes years to do it. And now we're at the point, and then the city didn't have any money to build it. So they turned to the private sector to build it, and that's the point that we decided to jump in. We hadn't been doing all that work. We were watching. We weren't involved, but we decided if we could get involved at this crucial point and try to get it over the top, it could get built. And the problem I have with this smaller shelters idea is that, okay, so if we could snap our fingers and create all these shelters across the city versus snap our fingers and create the Homeless Services Center, I don't know which one is better. They would both be great. It'd be a wonderful thing to house everybody. But that, like Colin says, that other plan, I'm a developer. I know what it takes to get something done in a community, in a neighborhood. And not only is there no money, it's just not going to happen. And even if it did happen and you had 5 dedicated developers and 5 funding plans and 5 shelter managers, and you had it all figured out and you kept the political consensus together throughout all those years, how many years would it take to do it, and how many people are going to die in the meantime? And what are all those outcomes, for, like Colin was speaking so eloquently about, what is going to happen to all those people while we are studying the problem? And to me, that's I'm not a big person that goes around and talks about privilege this and privilege that a lot, but that's an incredible privilege to be able to say, let's study this more. I just think it's wrong, so that's why I'm trying to change it.
Thanks, Kevin. So we're going to move to audience questions in just a moment, but I would be remiss if I didn't talk about what's happening at the state and the federal level. There's a tremendous amount of federal resources that are coming into Maine and particularly into Greater Portland. The Cumberland County has over $50 million that it's looking to spend of American Rescue Plan Act. Municipalities have that money. The state has that money. And then we also have a zoning commission that's chaired by Senator Hickman and Speaker Ryan Fecteau, who's looking at zoning changes. And Jeff, we are running out of time, but I'm wondering, can you, in the 2 seconds that it's going to take us to do 5 hours of work, right? Can you tell us a little bit about what you think the biggest opportunities are for the feds and the state to help us out?
Sure. I think there is often this feeling in Maine of we're home rule, the state doesn't tell cities and towns what to do. And honestly, that's very erroneous. The state tells cities and towns what to do all the time. The only difference is when the state is silent, cities and towns can do more than they can in, say, Vermont, where they don't have home rule in the same way. I think one of the biggest things the state can do right now is to create more guardrails around what zoning can do in this state. And to say, you can use zoning for legitimate health, safety, and welfare causes, but we have statewide goals for things like housing, and you can't use zoning to not embrace those. You can have some leeway as to how to implement them, but I think there needs to be more framework in 30A in terms of how communities can use zoning. Right now, communities will do all sorts of things with zoning that really have very little to do with base health, safety, and welfare, and have a lot to do with extending privilege and keeping people out. And I think that's something that's going to have to change. I think the commission's the easy part. The hard part's going to be at the legislature when these proposals go forward into bills.
And that's how chamber members can help out. So if there's some good housing proposals that come before the legislature, we hope that you guys can weigh in and also support good housing and good zoning at the local level. So we didn't get into the federal funds, but maybe we'll have some questions from the audience on that. I do want to open it up if people would like to ask our panelists some questions. Otherwise, I have a lot more I could ask. Susan.
Good morning. Gentlemen, is this on?
Yeah.
Thank you. Gentlemen, thank you for providing your incredible knowledge. This is the most amazing synopsis that I have heard, so thank you for sharing your hearts and your brains. And Kristina, lovely facilitation. Thank you. My question is, I'm curious to know if you know of developers, mayors, communities, cities in North America where we could be looking to learn some best practices or case studies. Jeff is Urban Land Institute doing some interesting work. I don't think we are the only community or state in North America that is facing all these complex issues. Where can we turn to learn from what others have already done? Thank you.
What a great question, Susan. Thank you. Who would like to take that? Jeff, I've got to pick on you just because
Sure.
you've got the academic perspective.
I mean, I'll jump in. First, I want to give credit within our region. There are communities doing a lot of work in this region. Portland gets a lot of flack. Portland is by far doing the most of any community in this region to try to address a full range of housing options. Close behind it are Westbrook and Windham. I think those are communities that have really embraced this idea of a variety of housing choices. So there are communities in this region doing a lot of work. Outside of this region, there's many communities. You hear a lot about Minneapolis abolishing single-family zoning and Seattle doing similar work. In the Boston area, I think the city of Somerville, under Mayor Curtatone, who's leaving after 18 years, has done a tremendous amount to try to plan for a variety of housing choices. It's been tough there, like it is here, because it's so expensive, and the market is pushing that market so high. But certainly, he and his staff are doing everything they can to push back on that market. And I think that's a place where you can learn a lot about what some of the cutting-edge practices are in a New England home rule context.
Great.
We have time for one more question.
Hello, thank you for, just want to make, great, it's on. Hello, thank you for having me. I'm a USM student currently. I'm very grateful to be here and to be in the presence of some really beautiful minds in our community. My question is in regards to the recent vote in Berlin. I don't know if you're familiar. Essentially what has occurred is in Berlin, the people voted to buy back private property and make it into affordable housing. Very brief synopsis of a very complicated situation. Is that something that you think works in Europe but doesn't work in North America, or is that something that you think could be an example of what could happen here? Thank you.
Kevin?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, it could work. Is the political will there to buy private property and turn it into affordable housing in Portland? I would suggest quite possibly yes. In general, though, taking one step back from buying private land and turning it into affordable housing, there's this idea that the cities often have a lot of excess municipal land. And I don't agree with Ethan Strimling on everything or a lot of things. And are we allowed to say Ethan Strimling here? Hi, Ethan. But one thing he's right about is that Portland had a lot of excess municipal land, and it can be converted into affordable housing, and it can be upzoned, and it can be a lot of units built on it. So I think that's the most low-hanging fruit in that area, is look at the land that cities already have. But you know, the Berlin approach, which I didn't know about that project, I think it could work under certain circumstances, but I'm not sure it would ever work outside of Portland, at least with today's politics.
Thank you, Kevin. So we're going to wrap up and welcome Britt back up to the stage. But first, I'd like to ask you all to join me in a round of applause for these beautiful minds.
That was awesome. I've been in a lot of housing conversations, and the amount of succinct wisdom that I just heard from this whole crew up here is incredible. I hope this gets viewed. I'm going to go watch this again. This was really high quality stuff, so thank you, Rose. Like there's quotable lines I needed to write down more, so I'm going to have to go back and watch it all back. So thank you again. As we conclude this program, you can view a complete list of the Chamber's upcoming events at the Chamber's website. We encourage you to subscribe to the Chamber's newsletter and be sure to follow the Chamber across all social media platforms. We look forward to seeing you again in the fall as we continue our Eggs and Issues events in November with a presentation by Dr. Laura Freed, President of the Maine College of Art and Design, and we will certainly be doing more on housing. Thank you very much. We'll see you next month.